Good morning on this truly magnificent April day, as our country moves to an over-the-hill election that nobody ever thought was going to have the two so far dominant players and front runners move on, as you've experienced last time. Experience all the misgivings, all the ups and downs, all the different players being swept aside. Who would have ever thought? Spencer Piston is an assistant professor of political science at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. I don't know about anybody in this room, but the Maxwell School is a begotten institution. Believe me, it is dynamite. His research has been published and accepted for publication in leading political science journals, including the Journal of Politics, Public Opinion Quarterly, Public Behavior, Political Communication, and Political Psychology. He was named a distinguished junior scholar by the Political Psychology section of the American Political Science Association. Today, the Manlius Informed Speaker Series is pleased and gifted to welcome our speaker today, Spencer Piston, who will chat with us about a very interesting aspect of elections, racial prejudice. Please welcome Spencer Piston.
Well, thank you so much for having me. One of the difficult things about being a professor, I've only been a professor for the last couple of years now, just coming out of grad school in Michigan, is the research you conduct is by necessity very narrow. You have to focus pretty narrowly to get something done. And yet you want to be able to talk about very broad things. So there's a lot of stuff that someone with broader knowledge than I can talk about. What just happened yesterday in New York in particular. What goes into people's minds as they choose which candidates to go for. So many things could matter. Policy positions, what you think of the candidate in the particular, how attached are you to your party. I'm just going to focus on one small aspect of the decision-making process here. And I'm going to speak not just, as well, I should say, about the 2016 election, although there are some results pertaining to that election, but more broadly, the role of racial prejudice in American politics. This project, I should say, is co-authored with Ashley Jardina. She and I went to graduate school together, or stayed in touch and working together. But essentially what we want to do is to help folks rethink the nature of racial attitudes. We believe scholars and political pundits alike have potentially overlooked the full range of white racial attitudes. We want to bring your attention to a particular form of racial prejudice that's fundamental and disturbing, the dehumanization of blacks, and the implications of that form of prejudice for white political preferences, including preferences in the 2016 election. So I'll begin with this quotation here. If you ask most political scientists someday, or if you ask most political scientists today, some will say, "Wow, prejudice against blacks is no longer a formidable obstacle. It's not all that common. It used to be much more common." Certainly there's a grain of truth to this. If you look at the survey responses, expressed racially prejudicial attitudes are less common than they used to be. Others say, actually, racial prejudice is still widespread, but it takes a different form than it used to. It used to be, in this account, that many white folks held biologically racist attitudes. They believed blacks to belong to an inherently inferior race. But that's gone. The type of racial prejudice we see today is a shadow of what it was. Still formidable, but a cultural form of racism. Things such as, perhaps black people don't try as hard as they might. Perhaps they're not as clean or as hardworking as some of the rest of us. This is the sort of more modern form of racism that many scholars think have displaced old-fashioned forms of racial bias. And what I want to ask today is, have these old-fashioned forms of racial bias really been displaced? Has old-fashioned or overt racism really disappeared? We're going to do a very brief history of scientific racism. As a professor, I'm keenly aware that professors before me used the authority of science to advance biologically racist claims. Some people studied skull sizes. Some of you may have heard of this, phrenology. They said the cranium of the European, people of European descent represents the more civilized, evolved form of man, and the cranium of the Negro, of black people, is closer to monkeys. There's some evidence psychologists have found that these associations persist subconsciously. For example, when subliminally primed with black male faces, subliminal priming is when you're shown something too fast to be conscious of it, but it still might register in your brain. When that's done, respondents are more quickly able to identify blurred images of apes, suggesting they have an association in their brain between black male faces and apes. Or if you're subliminally primed with a word associated with apes, monkey, chimp, etc., again, it's subliminal, so you're not even aware you're getting this. And then asked to watch a video of police beating a suspect, those subjects primed with the ape language were more likely to say the beating was justified if they had just seen this ape word and the subject being beaten was black. So these social psychologists have found, but is this just a residual subconscious level thing? Or is there something more that people are actually willing to endorse openly? Here are some examples. Many folks have heard about the Central Park jogger. Right, there was a group of young black, we call them children or young adults, age 14 to 16, I call them children. They were wrongly charged, right, and later exonerated. And you see here the animal metaphor is used here to describe them in the paper, called wilding, called part of a wolf pack. Right? Animal metaphor is used to describe innocent, in this case, black youth. The early 1990s, this came out during the Rodney King beating, later acquittal. It came out the California State Police commonly referred to crimes involving young black men as NHI, no humans involved. More recently, in my view, this is a little more ambiguous, but I'll put it here anyway. This is in 2009, published in the New York Post. This was a time when I think there actually was a rabid chimpanzee running around, and this is what this is in reference to. But this is making an equivalence between the President of the United States, the first black president, and a rabid chimpanzee. Even more recently still, a police officer was caught on video with the Michael Brown protesters calling them animals. Well, not all the protesters were black, so it's not necessarily a racist thing to say. And you might call people all sorts of names without having dehumanizing attitudes. But there's at least some ambiguity here that we think is worth exploring. And so we examine in our project the prevalence and political consequences of explicit white dehumanization of blacks. That is, which white people are willing to say they hold certain views toward blacks that we believe to be dehumanizing. So how many whites are willing to do this is our first question. And second, do these attitudes matter for white political preferences? And we're going to talk about the 2016 election in particular, albeit briefly. So we've got a couple studies here, and I'm happy to provide more details, but these are both national samples. One is recruited through Mechanical Turk. These are white respondents only. You see we did these studies pretty recently. This one's August 2015. And the other one's in March 2016. And there are two different ways we measure dehumanization. I think this is a really tough thing to measure, and we want to make sure that any results we find aren't just an artifact of using a single measure. So here's the first one. It said, okay, people can vary in how human-like they seem. Using the image below, please indicate using the sliders how evolved you consider the average member of each group to be. So this is straight out of the scientific racism playbook. Right? Here's the typical ascent of man scale. Right? It's very straightforward. How evolved is each group on this scale? Ask how they rate blacks and how they rate whites. Closer to monkeys or ape-like ancestors is actually would be more appropriate, or closer to full upright male. This is only one measure, and it has some key limitations in my view. One of which is that not everyone subscribes to the belief that evolution occurred. So we have another measure, and my understanding is that those folks, because we have to do some open-ended as well. What went through your mind when you were asking this? Some people say, I don't believe evolution happened. I'm a creationist, and so I just rated everybody equally. So this measure would not detect dehumanization among those folks. That's a limitation of that. But there's another one coming. I'm going to give you some of the results here. These are for all white respondents. And this right here, this dot represents the average response for what was given for whites. So see, on average, people gave whites about 96 out of 100. Now, why wouldn't everyone just say 100? Aren't we all humans? Aren't we all at this end? Isn't this a crazy question to ask in the first place? Some people appear to take the view that we're still evolving. We have a way to go. So some people would rate every group, for example, we've asked about other groups in other cases, they rate every group a 75. So we're still on our way. So that's why perhaps some groups could be rated equally in terms of how far we've evolved, but not all the way at 100. So this is the average response people gave for whites, and here's the average response they gave for blacks. Now these little bars here are confidence intervals, sort of a statistical thing to say. Any sample we take, there's some uncertainty. The key thing we want to say is, are these intervals overlapping? And actually what we see is a higher rating on average that our white respondents give. On average, whites are rated as more evolved than blacks are in our sample. Now, what if we just look at Democratic respondents? Not just Republicans. We look at Democrats. We look just at whites who are Democrats. We see also that whites are rated as more evolved than blacks. Not by quite as much, I should note. This is like being a Republican makes you. Sorry, Republicans are more likely to say that blacks are less evolved than whites. Yeah.
What's the horizontal scale?
This it's not exactly a scale. The way I would put it is, we have two categories. Two groups were rated. Whites were rated, and on how evolved they were, and blacks were rated with respect to how evolved they were.
There is no horizontal scale.
Exactly. Yeah, I should have said, and perhaps it's already the convention here, but please feel free to interrupt with questions at any time. If we just look at liberals, what do they think? People who self-identify as liberal white folks are more likely to rate whites as more evolved than blacks on average. What if we just look at women? So this isn't something that's just restricted to men either. What if we look at young people? So this doesn't appear to be something that's a relic. Something that young people are growing up with.
But are those white children or and white women, or who was asked when you did the women and the children?
Yeah, sorry. These headings, if we only look at the white women who were asked these questions, we see the same pattern. If we only look at the white youth who were asked these questions, we see the same pattern.
Thank you.
They're all Democrats still, or no?
No.
No.
Just check it.
So we had a second measure. And the reason we had the second measure is, as I said, some people don't believe in evolution, for one. Others might not know what the term evolved means, right? And we just want to make sure there are these strange pictures that we have. And what are people making of this? So we said, let's just see if we get similar results with a very different measure. So we asked people, how well do you think each of the following characteristics tend to describe most blacks? And we picked these because these are terms that folks have been found to use when you say, oh, describe apes. These are some of the adjectives that come up. These two in particular, and this is something that's been used in previous research. Just said a negative quality that sort of ties into being animal-like. So what we say here is certainly some denial of these dehumanizing traits. 56% of whites say barbaric describes blacks not at all well. But we see the remaining 44% say it describes them at least slightly well, and some all the way up to extremely well. Same with savage. Again, the main response is not at all well, certainly, but still substantial dehumanization here. And same with lacking self-restraint like animals. So we can make those into a scale. 46% of whites say blacks have none of these characteristics, but the rest. So in sum, we find on average white respondents rate blacks as less evolved than they rate whites, and a considerable percentage of whites attribute dehumanizing characteristics to blacks. Now, we really wanted to make sure our survey questions meant the same thing to our respondents as they did to us. It's always a concern in survey research. You ask somebody a question, they answer, and then you say, okay, this person believes this. But what if they understood the question to mean something different? So we just asked them, what were you thinking as you answered these questions? What made you answer the way you did? And we're really interested to see, is this actually dehumanization or is this something else? I'll give you just a sampling of the responses. I highlight certain words in red to illustrate the point here. I'll just give you a second to read over what folks typed out. This is all over the internet. Now, all of these respondents rated blacks as less evolved than they rated whites. What did they mean by that? To say one group is less evolved than another, what does that mean? Well, they're willing to tell us what they meant. They're saying blacks are closer to animals and whites are closer to humans. This is dehumanization, plain and simple. Yeah?
What part of the world was this survey taken? Because I'm feeling that if you took it to the north or the south or the west, you'd get different answers. So is this survey taken at a university or in some location?
Good question. I didn't talk enough about that. This is a nationally diverse sample taken over the internet. People are recruited over the internet. It's not nationally representative in the sense of people didn't have an equal probability of being selected. We just received a grant to do some of this on a nationally representative sample, and I'll have better answers for you then. I haven't yet seen strong correlations with region. I'll tell you my own prejudice, which is I'll expect to find some more endorsement of this in the South, but substantial proportions of people not in the South will think this as well. But I don't have a great answer for you yet as to how much. All I can say is these folks came from all over the country. Yeah.
A lot of this, I think, we're being brainwashed by the news media, because that's what we see every night on our televisions and in our newspapers. We're not seeing the good side of blacks, whites, whichever. We're all seeing the same murders by the same colored whatever. So we're all being brainwashed, I think. But if you've worked with some of these people, you know they're just as well as the rest of us. But we're not seeing that.
So I wholeheartedly agree with you for two reasons. One is, my own experience watching, or I guess for three. One is my own experience watching the news media is the same as yours. A second is scholars study local news, especially local crime news, and figure out who's depicted as violent criminals and who isn't, disproportionate to actual rates.
Yeah.
And third, seeing them, people mention this all the time. This comes up. This is what I see on, why did you answer this way? This is what I see on the news. People tell us straight up.
Could I make a comment?
Please.
Early in the 19th century, when the immigration was great, Syracuse newspapers that I know of would say if an Italian was arrested, Joe Bonito, Italian, was arrested. They had, wasn't only the name, but then they put Italian there. So I'm agreeing that the press perpetuates some of this stuff.
Thank you. Yeah.
If you look at the 4 items that you have listed there, the first one I would consider, okay, racist. The other 3 could have been attached to any article in regards to, you know, whether it be a white person, Chinese person, whatever, they committed a crime. And because they're referring to the perception portrayed by the article, not necessarily that it was white or black.
Yes, that's right. But given that all these folks actually rated blacks as less evolved than they rated whites, and this is the justification for it, that's the reason why I'm interpreting this as dehumanization. Now, if there were if the pattern were the reverse, if more people had rated whites as less evolved than blacks, for example, I would have been forced to conclude the reverse.
Going to do a study like this with yellows?
Yes, go ahead.
Do you assume that if you were to do a similar test or census, would you get a different response if you used
Native Americans too.
rather than Americans?
Spencer, could you repeat the question?
Yeah. The question is whether, and I'm going to take these 2 questions together. The first is, what would I have gotten if I'd asked about yellows? Second is, what would I get if I asked about Europeans?
Well, not about them. If you ask Europeans the same
Oh,
question.
I'm sorry. Oh, okay, so these are different questions then.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll take that one first. So we have not done it, so I don't know. But I do know that Europeans routinely throw bananas at dark-skinned soccer players. Now, I don't know how prevalent that is in Europe compared to here, but the association between black people and H is not limited to the United States. I just don't know how widely it's pervading in Europe. Now, your question I didn't answer right away because I'm not sure I've understood it. Could you say more?
No, I just,
Who are the yellows?
I guess Japanese, Chinese, people like the
Asians.
Asians.
So you mean
and
other
Asian.
ethnicities and races,
Other-
like Muslims
other-
too, right?
Refer to them as other
Yeah, then we
colors
get to
too,
religion.
you know, the yellow peril, that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
I see. Yeah, actually, we've asked these questions about how do you feel about Asians is the term that we've used. They tend to score as about as evolved as whites.
They can play the violin.
Now, are these attitudes consequential? We aren't just interested. I'm a political scientist. I am interested in this election. I want to know not just that these attitudes exist, although that's important. I want to know how they play out in political life. And I won't be exhaustive here. This just takes a second to get through. I'm sorry for the graph. But I will get there. We just take it one piece at a time. So this scale is warmth toward Obama. Just ask people, how warm do you feel toward Barack Obama? It's actually a 0 to 100 scale. I've compressed it here from 0 to 1. So the midpoint is 0.5. Right, that's sort of neither warm nor cold. Okay, now, here we have the neutral point where whites and blacks are rated equally on the evolutionary scale. And here we have the most extreme possible response. where whites are rated as most evolved, blacks are rated as least evolved. So that's the x-axis. The other tricky thing is you have to hold other factors constant. So for example, it is true that Republicans are more likely to hold dehumanizing attitudes toward black people. So if I were to say, oh, folks who dehumanize blacks are less likely to support Obama, you could say, well, is that because of their racial attitudes, or is that because they're Republican, which happens to be related to their racial attitude? I might say, well, does it just happen to be part of their racial attitude? But that's a separate issue, right? For now, we can say over and above the effects of other factors, party identification, conservatism, and demographics, we see that those folks who hold dehumanizing views of blacks are especially likely to hold cold views toward Obama. That's what this negative slope shows us. Now, in general, white people all over the scale don't think very highly of Obama. That's true with a lot of outgoing presidents at a lot of times anyway. Right? But even those folks who do not view blacks as less evolved than whites, they're still just near the midpoint. Right? But this goes down considerably. The importance of this, of course, for the 2016 election is we know that presidential elections are so often a referendum on the incumbent. Right? You say, get them out if you don't think they've done a good job. Go to the other party. Yes?
Can you foresee Muslims replacing the blacks in that process within the near future?
That's a great question.
Whoa.
So, the question is that could perhaps dehumanization toward Muslims might become more of an issue than dehumanization toward blacks in the near future? Did I say it right? So I'll say a few things. So, Muslims are viewed as not wholly separable from blacks, in the sense that there's some form of colorism that can happen when thinking about Muslims. Obama's a prime example. It's because of his background that accusations of him as a Muslim have been able to stick. So the two are not wholly separable.
Still comes back to the news media though. They're the one that play it up.
It reflects the news media that you're listening to. Don't take that personally. What I'm saying to you is that they do not, the blacks do not have a news media that's theirs. The whites do have a media that's theirs. And the same thing goes to the Muslims. They do not have their own news media. And you're, by the nature of humanistics, you're attracted to the white media.
I like this news media angle. We haven't studied much ourselves the extent to which dehumanizing depictions of people of different racial groups are perpetuated. Maybe we need to do more of that as it becomes a bigger project. Yes?
During wartime, you see the acceleration of this. So right now, Asians are okay. During the Second World War, they were dehumanized. All of our enemies are dehumanized during war. Look at what the Vietnamese were called, what the Japanese were, what the Germans were called. I'm sure they called us names. So under times of stress, and the media comes to play in that because they repeat those words like gook and all the other words that were used.
I think that's a fantastic response to your question, a better one than I gave. And I'll just add to it a little, though, by saying I think the particular association between the particular form of dehumanization, which is a link between black people and apes, I think that has a long history.
Yes.
And you can't easily replace that association with Muslims. You might have to dehumanize them in different ways to make that happen. I'm not ruling out dehumanization, but I think it might have to take a different form. Yes?
I just wanted to say, I think a lot of this has to do with your own personal life history, especially your professional history. I worked in healthcare, and I was exposed to a lot of Asian, Black, white Muslim people, and certain exposures colored my view of the whole class.
Mhm. I will
And
say,
I think in teaching, my sister-in-law is a teacher, and she has been exposed to the same thing. She admits that,
Mhm.
you know, she's colored by the kids that act out and their racial or cultural backgrounds. And I just think that has impressed me more than any media, any friends, my husband, anyone.
I think that's a great point. In fact, that's one thing I didn't get a chance to mention in these. I've read so many of these now. And a lot of people did mention the news media, and many others did mention their personal interactions.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Right? We might have fair or unfair generalizations based on our personal reactions, but those interactions are real and they matter. Okay, and now let's look at attitudes toward Trump. The presumptive Republican nominee who, as you all know, just won in this state. So without going through it too much, we see the exact opposite pattern. Those white folks who think whites are more evolved than blacks are more likely to view Trump warmly than those whites who view whites and black people as equally evolved.
Did you collect socioeconomic information on these people too?
Yes. I don't see much, so that's being controlled for here, so that can't be driving this relationship. But I also don't see much of a relationship between socioeconomic status and these dehumanizing attitudes.
How about religion?
Actually, religion is something we haven't been able to do much with. We have not yet had the survey space to ask about that. I'm curious what you think, what role you think religion might play, because I'm interested in
It might have something to do with your prejudice.
Yeah, how so? Do you have a sense of how so? I've been trying to think that through myself.
What did you say?
What do you think religion might have to do with our prejudices? How would it impact?
Definitely.
Yeah.
I would just guess historically the Mormon faith has not been inclusive of blacks, and that may influence those.
Sure, there's rhetoric in some these days very small circles about the curse of Ham and so forth. There's a history of that rhetoric. So I've got just one more thing, which is just not quite the election, but it's just about policy preferences. And basically, I need to find a better way to present this, but I'll put this up here for now and just give you a second to take a look. So here's what we did. So half of our experimental subjects were randomly assigned to read this. We're about to ask you some questions. Before we do, read the following information about inmates. And we told them, okay, 95% of people in prison in New York City are male. This is true. 77% are less than 40 years old. And then we embedded this racial information. This group was told 40% of people in prison are black, 52% are white. This is correct, by the way. In New York State. And then the other half were randomly assigned to this condition, which is the exact same. Except one little thing was changed in the middle here. They were just told that more people are in prison are black. That's the only, and fewer are white. And then we said, hey, by the way, what do you think about this stop-and-frisk policy? Some of you have heard of this.
Yeah.
Police detain and search individuals on the street without arresting them, or they did. The policy's been ruled unconstitutional, but the city's appealing it, trying to keep it going. So we said, what do you think? We just asked people, are you worried that without this stop-and-frisk program, crime will get out of control? How important is it to use this? How necessary is it to have this program? How much would you support it? There's 4 questions that we combine into an index of support for these stop-and-frisk policies. And what we find is, actually not much support for this. This is a 0 to 1 scale here. I'm only showing up through 0.4. You see that average support is pretty low. This is something like 25% of people say they like these policies, more or less. This is an average, but more or less. This is the control condition where they're told that 40% of inmates are black. But in this condition, when folks are told that 80% of prison inmates are black, support is actually higher. Again, this is all just only white folks. This is a statistically significant effect. Now, this is consistent with previous research, but previous research hasn't really told us why. It seems kind of crazy to a lot of folks. And we thought, well, if you don't view black people as fully human, and they're the ones who are disproportionately victimized, then this actually makes a certain perverse sort of sense. And so we looked at the effects of our experiment among those who scored the neutral point. They view whites and blacks as equally evolved. And there actually is no effect. These are essentially the same. But if we look at the rest of the sample, those people who think white folks are more evolved than black folks, then this is what we see. It's these folks who really come to support the policy once they believe such a large proportion of New York State prisoners are black. So I'll end on this slide. Say not only are these views widespread, not all that widespread. Many white people do not hold dehumanizing views of blacks, or at least don't admit to them. But there are quite a few who do. And they're more likely to view Obama negatively. They're more likely to support Trump. And they become more supportive of policies when it appears that these policies are racially discriminatory. So there's a very old form of prejudice that's still very much with us, depressingly and disturbingly, and it continues to profoundly influence political life today, including the 2016 presidential election. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your continued questions and comments. Yes?
Have you done any research about the biases between men and women? If, for instance, a man's voice is harsh or strong, he's considered strong. A woman's voice is harsh and she's harsh and negative. And there are many, I could go on and on about that, but I just wondered if you've done any research about that and what your opinion is.
I have done a little, not as part of this project. People have thought about different forms of sexism, right? And one is sort of what roles are people expected to fill? That's the part that's what I take yours to be talking about, right? If someone tries to be a leader, tries to be stern, tries to make a strong comment, that is perceived differently depending on that person's gender, because a woman may be perceived as not suitable for certain types of roles. So that has been measured by other scholars, and it does appear to be an important attitude that's pretty consequential. I am starting to think about under what conditions are women dehumanized, particularly as objects of male sexual desire. Right? When people say object, they mean object, non-human. So under what conditions does that happen? When does that matter? But I'm sorry, I haven't even started. We're about a quarter of the way through this thing. We got to get this done first, unfortunately. Yeah.
Okay.
Just, you've identified a problem, and without disputing the validity of any of your conclusions and the analysis, which is based on the data and everything else, Most of us historically are aware of how various peoples immigrated to this country, the Irish, the Italians, and other ethnic groups. They got here, there was often rampant prejudice against those groups initially. They settled in the cities, including Syracuse. We all know that there are neighborhoods in Syracuse, Irish, Italian, whatever, or at least formerly. Those groups then availed themselves of the educational system. Their kids tended to do better than they did, went to college. Many of those groups moved out of the city. They moved socioeconomically, the group as a whole advanced. There probably are a bunch of people in this room who are Irish, Italian, and other ethnic backgrounds, and they were assimilated, so to speak. And prejudice diminished as a result of that process. But if you look around this room, you don't see, I don't think, an African-American person. And so those of us who had contact with such people, such as the gentleman that talked earlier, understand that the overall group prejudice makes no sense because they've had direct person-to-person interaction. But if you have no experience in that regard, and if this group that you're rightly saying that has been prejudiced against remains concentrated in the city to a great extent, with minimal mixing outside the city, then how is the situation improved? You know what I mean? It's a complex situation, especially socioeconomically. And,
There are a lot of deep issues that you get at in this question, and one of them has to do with segregation versus integration. And that's the one I'll talk about the most. Right? So we've talked about interpersonal experiences here as both having the potential to reduce prejudice and the potential to exacerbate it. I don't know under what conditions it does one versus the other, and I don't think scholars know that as well as we need to know. Certainly, if the reduction of prejudice requires interpersonal contact and segregation prohibits that, then certainly segregation is a problem. Now, what exactly is causing segregation? That is a separate issue that I'm less qualified to speak to than I'd like. Is it individual choice? Is it public policy decisions? I tend to believe it has more to do with public policy decisions.
Yes.
But maybe I shouldn't have said that because I can't present evidence for that here. I just want to note, though, that the most integrated white folks and black folks have ever been was in the South during slavery, when they lived in the same homes. And that,
again.
I don't think that was sufficient to reduce white dehumanizing attitudes toward blacks. So I'm somewhat skeptical of the argument that integration would substantially change the distribution of white racial attitudes. Just a thought. Yeah.
If you remember the scene in 12 Years a Slave, when slaves were forced to sit at Sunday service, and the slave owner quoted the Bible to justify that slavery was a God-given right to white people. I'm fascinated always by the ones who make exception. Like they may dehumanize everybody but Ben Carson, because he's a brain surgeon. They might dehumanize everybody but Robin Roberts, who was voted one of the most beautiful women in the world. And Serena Williams, who is so talented on the tennis. It always fascinates me. It's like Catholics who my son calls cafeteria Catholics. My mother was one. I'll take this, but I won't do that. And so it fascinates me that, how does the mind operate in these people? Where you have Bill Cosby's son being killed because he's in a Porsche and the wrong neighborhood. That would happen even today. So, I don't know, it's just a comment about how people use their religion, actually. Many Christians on the right justify the dehumanization of blacks. At the same time, they tell you that God was perfect. Well, if he was perfect, why did he make this mistake?
Well, it's clear from this comment and the other one, we haven't thought nearly enough about religion and the role it might play here. So thank you. We'll continue to think about that. Yes.
And yet we, the same people idolize and hero worship the athletes and the musicians and the actors.
Yeah.
The athletes. By the way, I don't know if anybody know Pearl Washington died today.
Oh, that's too bad.
Talking about our athletes that we set up and exclude from the group.
Yeah, so these last couple of comments have gotten us, so psychologists call this subtyping.
Yeah.
You write an exception, and in fact, the exception can sort of reinforce the group attitude. If you say, well, that person doesn't really count as part of that group,
Yeah.
then rather than disproving my negative beliefs about the group, they confirm it because they don't fit. Yes.
I'd like you to address the fact that Ben Carson, in the discussions, always had to say, I'd like you to give me a question. I would like to have you hear me out. It happened too much.
You mean that's what Ben Carson was saying? You're
Ben Carson
quoting-
wasn't called upon to.
He wasn't called.
to speak his
That's because
mind.
he was crazy.
Is that a white media problem, or is that just?
That's what I'm wondering. No, well.
I should have been category three. Same stand.
I think it's a great question. I don't
He should be in
really-
the operating room.
I don't really know the answer, but I think it's absolutely worth thinking about, whether it has something to do with this race. It's absolutely worth thinking about. One possibility too is just the media knew, and there are there are records of top executives boasting about how Donald Trump was the best thing ever for their ratings.
Yeah.
You can see that in the way they structured the debates. Every question would be like, Trump said this about you, how do you respond? And then while the person was responding, they show Trump on the split screen.
The exact statement was, this may not be good for the country, but it's good for me. And, no, the
I have
CEO
seen that.
said that.
I have seen that,
Yeah.
thank you. Yes.
Could you relate any of these conclusions a little bit more on where we stand today?
Can't hear you.
Relate these findings to where we stand in the election? Sure. We live in a majority white country.
Today.
Look at this room.
I hear a lot of people saying not for long.
That's right.
For this election, we live in a majority white nation, and the concentration of Latinos and African Americans is such that even relative to their population, they command a small percentage of the electoral vote. So the attitudes of whites matter a ton when determining who's going to win and who's going to lose. Among those white people, substantial proportions of them hold some form of racial prejudice against blacks, including the one I've talked about here today. And those folks are likely to view Obama negatively and thus react against his party, and they're more likely to view Trump positively. So thank you for pushing me to articulate this in the context of the election. Dehumanization of blacks is an advantage for the Republicans in the 2016 presidential election. That's the takeaway.
So what you're saying is that, given that Obama is black, and there could be some white sore feelings, that the Republicans, just by the nature of reaction, or the white people, just by the nature of reaction, are going to vote for the Republican candidate.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's some of that is speculation, but I'm willing to endorse that speculation. Yeah, I mean, this is one of the best predictors of an outcome of the next election is approval of the incumbent in the last election.
It's gone up though.
Yes.
Having listened to you, how do you explain Obama getting elected then?
Twice.
That's a
Good question.
Yeah.
Certainly, white racial prejudice is not an insuperable obstacle. Not for the first black president of the United States. He got 43% of the white vote.
Well, he's 50% white.
Don't forget that part.
Which disproves what you're saying.
Oh, no, not at all.
He's the white person.
No. The fact that this is an excellent point about his heritage, but I'm gonna leave it aside for the moment. The fact that someone with a Kenyan father can win the election to be what some have called the first black president of the United States shows that racial prejudice is not an insuperable obstacle, but it doesn't mean that it's not an obstacle. In fact, there are, 43%, if only white people had voted, Obama would not have won the election. He underperformed the forecasts. He should have won in a landslide, according to most election forecasts. Prejudice against black people eroded Obama's white vote share, but not to a degree that was sufficient enough to cost him the election. So I've been talking up the importance of racial prejudice here. I absolutely need to acknowledge its limitations. It is not the only force that matters. For example, if the economy is doing great over the next year, it's going to be really tough for Trump, the presumptive nominee, to win. It's going to be really tough for Trump for a lot of other reasons. I said at the very beginning, and I meant to say this on purpose, I'm studying one aspect of decision making here. It's an important one. It's by no means the only one, or even the most important one, in my view. Attachments to the two major parties, I think, play a bigger role than racial prejudice when folks choose between candidates.
Which is a good thing.
It is.
Rather than voting, this is just Lewis's opinion, rather than voting just on the prejudice point. The prejudice point, I'm sure everybody in this room finds it somewhat nauseating and somewhat disingenuous and somewhat hurtful. But if they're voting to the party, then they're voting to the party. You know, it's less of a humanistic concern than the discriminatory concern.
But isn't that prejudice?
Well, it's party prejudice, but it isn't racial prejudice.
Yeah, but if you can't go and vote for who you think's the best person, you only can vote Republican because you're Republican or Democrat. Aren't you prejudiced?
Well, let's ask another question.
Good going, Jim.
Have you seen, Spencer, any evidence that racial prejudice has increased or decreased since 2012?
No.
No increase, no decrease, it's the same nonsense.
I haven't seen any evidence of a decrease or an increase since 2012 or even since 2008. We talked about interpersonal contact. Not a lot of folks have met Obama, but there were a lot of folks who speculated once the first black president comes along and people learn that having a black leader isn't so bad, prejudice is going to decline. Once they're exposed to him on the news and he counters so many stereotypes, he's certainly intelligent and articulate.
They should have called that the Mitch McConnell.
But that didn't happen. So no, I haven't seen evidence of an increase. Now, over time, it does appear that this sort of biological racism I'm talking about, at least with other measures, has been declining, but that's leveled off as of the mid-1990s.
So it's the same old thing, basically.
Yeah.
You seem to be trying to relate this to parties. And I would expect that people that are on the right would disagree with a lot of the policies or a lot of things that went, on during his 8 years. Now, wouldn't that be, is that considered dehumanization because you disagree with those policies? If it was the other way around, the left side and it was a Republican in there, would that be considered dehumanization? Or I'm
Good
getting
question.
this, a big mix in here that I think there's other factors that are, I disagree with your policy, not because you're black.
Absolutely, no question. For example, let's suppose we can take two people. They're both incredibly concerned with racial discrimination and racial inequality. One of them thinks government needs to pass a whole bunch of policies that's going to set things right. Another thinks if government does so, they're actually going to backfire and make things worse than they did before. One opposes the policies, one supports them, but it has nothing to do with dehumanization. It has to do with beliefs about whether government is effective at solving problems. So this is only one aspect of decision making. But I want to point out in the experiment that we did, we only varied one thing. We only varied the proportion of New York inmates that were portrayed to be black. So this is a consideration that's not reducible to other concerns such as how we think about government. It's not the only consideration. There are many reasons to have different policy beliefs. There are many good reasons to support, I think, all of the candidates currently running, many of which have nothing to do with race. It's a consideration, and it's one that matters, but not the whole story.
Thanks.
Yeah.
If you were to turn your experiment around and give it to blacks with the title white superiority, would you get the same results, do you think?
Good question.
What was the question?
The question is, what if you gave this experiment to black people instead of white folks? And you know, the real interesting thing is, I said we live in a white majority nation. If you want to do a survey on only black people, it costs a lot more. They're harder to find. And so the survey company's charging more for them. And I have limited resources, so that's one of the reasons I study white people.
We're cheaper.
But I will say this.
That's fuzzy.
When I ask black people the same question of how evolved do you think these groups are, they're much more even-handed. On average, they rate whites and blacks equally. It's not to say that no black people hold negative views of white people, some do.
Oh, they do.
Right, but they're much more even-handed. So this isn't just a case of, oh, all groups view other groups negatively. There are cases where that applies, but not here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I had an interesting experience back when I was in high school. We had a fairly big black community within, I grew up in Ithaca. There's a fairly big black community down there. And they were excellent students in our high school. And they played football very well. And this one gal who was, she had 4 brothers. They all played on a football team, and she could play on the football team. So we elected her president of our class because she was excellent. And, you know, that was an impressive thing for me. And so I haven't been discriminated at all since then. So I know that there's interesting people.
Another point that speaks to the power of interpersonal experiences.
Yeah.
We've talked about.
Very definitely.
Yes.
Back a ways ago, when Colin Powell was being considered for a nominee and he decided not to run, I thought I saw polls that showed big support on a bipartisan basis at that time. And if that's true, how much does race really come into play rather than who the person is? Because now you have Obama.
That's a great question. Colin Powell is a very, very interesting and difficult example for scholars of racial prejudice to wrestle with. Because not only did he have high levels of bipartisan support, but he also had high levels of support among both whites with racially prejudiced attitudes and whites who didn't. There was no relationship there between racial prejudice and support for Colin Powell. Some have speculated that because he was seen as such a strong military presence, that support for the military sort of trumped all racial considerations. Some say because he was a Republican, that makes him fairly counter-stereotypical. Actually true, support for Ben Carson has very little to do with, appears to have very little to do with racial prejudice as well. So the short answer is I don't know, but I will say this, it is not at all a given that any black politician is going to suffer due to racial prejudice. There are, now, when and why do some appear to transcend that? I don't know. Maybe it's personality, maybe it's partisanship, maybe it's other factors, but I don't know. I think I'm not the only one. The discipline of political scientists, I don't think knows either. Good question. Yes?
Colin Powell was preceded by a senator from Massachusetts named Edwin Brooke.
Yep.
He was also Republican and African American. Similar background, not a military background, but he was elected in Massachusetts, presumably with a lot of white people's support. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been possible.
Hold it. I don't see how a black cannot get elected without white support.
True.
I mean, that's the axiom of it all. Okay. Obama doesn't get elected unless he has some element of white support. It's just a matter of numbers.
There's a Republican African American Senator Tim Scott now in South Carolina. So he's obviously got it, but he's a Republican, African American Republican.
Well, we've got Cory Booker.
Well, I think it's a matter of the sensibility of it all, that people don't look at the color of the potential elected official. They vote the person. Unfortunately,
Like
some
women.
people vote the color of their skin. And that's what Spencer's being here today is about. Understanding that element of psychological, philosophical bent, which within itself is crazy.
We
Or
all
as we say,
know.
Meshuggah. Next week's speaker is Kevin Schwab, who spoke last week. The subject is going to be the Inland Port Project.
Yeah.
Now, I hope you all understand or got a sense of what the Inland Port Project is. It's, if it ever happens and it does get funded, it'll be off of 481. Or it'll be in the railroad yards in East Syracuse. Or if it ever comes. But one of those two locations will be the location that will add economic thrust to our community. Supposedly, hopefully, maybe. That's what next week's is about. I can't thank Spencer enough for coming and enlightening us to a subject that is always on all of our minds, but have not been able to come out and surface up. So we have a clear understanding of our humanistic failings as it relates to racial prejudice. Sally, you got it, Sally?
I got it.
Something else?